In the official records of Salem Village, Massachusetts, the name appears just once. Written in ink faded to rust brown over 3 centuries. Tituba. No family name, no origin, only that single word marking the testimony of a woman who confessed to witchcraft in February 1692, then vanished from every document that followed as though she never was. But here is what the sanitized histories omit. Tituba's confession did more than start the Salem Witch Trials. It held details so specific, so unsettling, that magistrates ordered entire portions struck from the public record. For more than 200 years, historians called these pages lost. They were not lost. They were concealed. And what they unveil about the true nature of Salem's hysteria, about who orchestrated it and why, is a story that powerful families spent generations ensuring would never reach the light. Before we continue with the tale of Tituba and the conspiracy that made her disappear, if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of American history, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story that challenges everything you thought you knew. What occurred in Salem in 1692 was no accident. It was the final eruption of tensions built over a decade in a community already fracturing under its own contradictions. Salem Village in late 1691 was no place of peace. Despite what travelers saw, neat clapboard houses around a common, smoke rising into the gray Massachusetts sky, stone-walled fields speaking of backbreaking labor, the settlement was splitting from within. Only 15 years old as an independent parish, Salem Village existed in the shadow of its wealthier neighbor, Salem Town, where merchant ships brought prosperity the farmers could only dream of. The village held perhaps 600 souls spread across farmland growing rockier and less fertile each year. Families who had arrived with high hopes now struggled against thin soil, harsh winters, and the constant dread of raids from the north, where King William's War still raged against French and indigenous forces. The war had devastated the Massachusetts frontier. Since 1688, coordinated attacks by French forces and their Wabanaki allies had destroyed settlements throughout Maine and New Hampshire. Refugees flooded south, bearing tales of burning homes, captured families, and midnight massacres. Several Salem Village families had taken in these refugees, hearing first-hand accounts of violence that fed a pervasive anxiety. The enemy could be anywhere, could strike at any time. This fear of invisible threats would prove crucial to what was coming. Yet it was the internal conflicts that truly poisoned Salem Village. The western farmers, led by families like the Putnams, among the first settlers, resented the eastern landowners, who kept closer ties to Salem Town's merchant elite. This was not mere economic jealousy. It was a fundamental clash over the community's identity. Were they independent farmers building a godly commonwealth, or merely a rural appendage to Salem Town's commercial interests? The question infected every part of village life. These tensions showed most clearly in the village church, where the minister's position had become a battleground. The congregation had gone through 3 ministers in 15 years, each departure marked by bitter disputes over salary, housing, and authority. The Reverend Samuel Parris arrived in 1689, the latest attempt to bring stability to a fractured community. He would instead preside over its destruction. Parris was 46 when he came to Salem Village, a man whose life had been marked by failure and resentment. Born in London to a family with merchant ties, he had been sent to Harvard but never graduated. He tried trade in Barbados, where his father left him a small plantation, but proved incompetent at managing either the business or the enslaved people who worked it. By the mid-1680s, he was bankrupt, forced to sell most of his holdings. What he kept were 2 enslaved people, a man named John and a woman named Tituba. Even before they reached Massachusetts, whispered speculation surrounded Parris and Tituba. Some claimed she had been his concubine in Barbados, that his 1681 marriage to Elizabeth Eldridge was an attempt at respectability. No proof existed, but rumors persisted, fed by the fact that Parris entrusted Tituba with responsibilities far beyond the typical enslaved woman. She managed his household, had access to his papers, and was present at private family discussions. This unusual closeness would later seem significant. For Parris, ministry was less a calling than a last resort. The Puritan Church in Massachusetts was always short of educated ministers willing to serve rural parishes, and Parris's partial Harvard education was enough. He preached his first sermons in Salem Village in 1688 and, after months of negotiation over salary and property, was ordained in November 1689. He brought his wife Elizabeth, their 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, called Betty, and Susanna, his orphaned niece Abigail Williams, and his 2 enslaved people. From the start, Parris's ministry was contentious. He preached of invisible enemies and conspiracies against the righteous, sermons that darkened as winter neared. He saw threats everywhere, in congregation members who questioned his salary, in farmers who resisted his authority, in the land itself, which seemed hostile to godly settlement. His worldview was fundamentally paranoid, dividing all people into the saved and the damned, with the latter far outnumbering the former. He told his flock that Satan had established a kingdom in the wilderness around them, that demons walked among them disguised as neighbors. This rhetoric drew some villagers and repelled others. The Putnam family, led by Thomas Putnam and his brothers, became Parris's strongest supporters. They saw in him an ally against the Salem town faction and a voice for their vision of a pure, independent farming community. The Porter family and their allies, who maintained commercial ties to Salem town, viewed Parris as a divisive troublemaker. They withheld portions of his salary and challenged his right to the parsonage and its land. By late 1691, the village was split into 2 camps, with Parris's position growing ever more precarious. Into this poisoned atmosphere, each night Tituba disappeared, climbing the narrow stairs to the unheated attic room she shared with John. She was perhaps 30, though no one had ever asked. Her skin marked her as different in a community that prided itself on English purity. Whether she was African, indigenous, or mixed, the villagers debated in whispers. Some said she was Caribbean from the islands, others African by way of Barbados, still others insisted on Spanish or Portuguese blood. The truth was that no one knew, and no one cared enough to ask her directly. She was simply the Indian woman, or Parris's slave. Her identity was reduced to her status. Tituba spoke rarely, always in a peculiar accent some called Spanish, others Portuguese, still others a corrupted English picked up in the Caribbean. She had learned the language in Barbados, that much was known before Parris bought her and brought her to the frozen north. The transition must have been devastating, from tropical heat to New England winter, from a plantation with dozens of other enslaved people to isolation in a hostile village, from a place where a knowledge of herbs and healing was valued to one where such knowledge was viewed with suspicion. She worked from dawn until long after dark, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, caring for Betty and Abigail, spinning, weaving, making soap and candles, all the endless labor that kept a colonial household running. Parris paid her nothing, of course, she was property, not a person. Yet he depended on her completely. His wife Elizabeth was often ill, suffering from ailments never clearly diagnosed but leaving her bedridden for days. Without Tituba, the household would have collapsed. In the kitchen where Tituba spent most of her hours, a particular stone in the hearth had cracked from repeated heating and cooling. She would sometimes stare at that crack when she thought no one watched. The pattern resembled a bird in flight, wings spread wide. Those who noticed thought her simple-minded, prone to daydreaming. They had no idea she was remembering. Remembering what? The historical record is silent, but we can imagine, perhaps a life before enslavement, before the Middle Passage, the plantation, or the sale that brought her to Paris. Perhaps family, language, home, all that had been stripped away. Or perhaps she was simply planning, calculating, waiting for an opportunity she knew would eventually come. Because Tituba, as events would prove, was anything but simple-minded. The other person who spent significant time in the Parris household was Abigail Williams, Parris's niece. She was 11 in the winter of 1691–92, orphaned under circumstances never clearly explained. Some said her parents died in an Indian raid in Maine, others of disease. Parris had taken her in from family obligation, but treated her more as a servant than a daughter. Abigail slept in a small room off the kitchen, helped Tituba with chores, and received minimal education beyond basic reading and religious instruction. Abigail was sharp, observant, with a talent for reading people. She understood the tensions in the household, her uncle's resentment at his treatment by the congregation, her aunt's chronic illness, the whispered arguments over money. She also understood her own precarious position. If Parris's ministry failed, if the family had to leave Salem village, what would become of her? An orphaned girl with no property and no prospects had few options in colonial Massachusetts. She would likely be bound out as a servant. This anxiety made Abigail hyper-aware of power dynamics. She watched how her uncle wielded authority through sermons, how certain families commanded respect while others were dismissed. She noticed that accusations carried weight, that reputation could be destroyed by whispers. She was learning lessons that would soon prove catastrophic. Betty Paris, by contrast, was a fragile, anxious child. At 9, she was prone to nightmares and crying fits. Her father's dark sermons terrified her. He preached of children born in sin, of the devil seeking young souls, of torments awaiting the damned. Betty took these warnings literally, lying awake convinced demons waited in the shadows. Her mother's illness frightened her too. She had already lost one infant sibling, and the fear that her mother might die haunted her. The relationship between Betty and Abigail was complex. Close in age, they spent most of their time together, but they were not equals. Betty was the minister's daughter, entitled to deference. Abigail was the orphan dependent, always aware of her inferior status. This dynamic would become crucial as events unfolded. The winter of 1691–92 came early and stayed late. By January, snow lay 3 feet deep in places, and with supplies in many homes ran dangerously low. The Paris household suffered with the rest. The minister's salary was perpetually in arrears, paid partly in firewood that never seemed enough. Betty spent hours shivering by the insufficient fire while her father penned sermons about godly suffering. Abigail tried to entertain them with games and stories, but the long dark pressed in. The isolation was profound. In summer, children could play outside, women could visit neighbors, men could work in fields. But winter locked everyone indoors, sometimes for days when storms made travel impossible. The Paris household was particularly isolated because of the minister's conflicts with much of the congregation. Families that might have invited the children stayed away. The girls had few friends, little entertainment, endless empty hours to fill. It was Abigail who first asked Tituba to tell them stories. The enslaved woman resisted at first. Her place was to work silently, to be invisible despite her visible difference. But Abigail was persistent, and eventually, on a January evening when Reverend Paris was visiting a parishioner and Mrs. Paris lay ill in bed, Tituba sat with the 2 girls by the dying fire and began to speak. She told of Barbados, the impossible heat that made New England summer feel cool, plants blooming in colors that didn't exist in gray Massachusetts, birds that could mimic human voices perfectly. She described sugar plantations where hundreds of enslaved people worked fields stretching to the horizon, and the songs they sang to make labor bearable. She spoke of the ocean, vast and blue-green, so different from the cold gray Atlantic bordering Massachusetts. The girls were entranced. They had never traveled beyond Salem. The world Tituba described was exotic, almost unimaginable. They begged for more, and Tituba obliged. Night after night when circumstances allowed, she told of the different peoples in Barbados, Africans from various kingdoms, indigenous people from the mainland, Europeans from England, Spain, Portugal, Holland, all mixed in ways impossible in Puritan New England. Then, because the girls begged for something frightening, she told of the Obeah practitioners she had known, people who could read the future in eggs and water, who knew which plants could cure or kill, who understood forces English ministers never mentioned. She shouldn't have. She knew even as the words left her mouth that she was making a terrible mistake. But there was power in being listened to, in seeing these privileged white girls lean forward with wide eyes, hanging on her every word. For a few stolen hours, Tituba was not invisible. She was the center of attention, the keeper of knowledge, the one with power. It was intoxicating and dangerous in equal measure. The sessions continued, always in secret. Tituba taught them small tricks, how to crack an egg into a glass of water and interpret the shapes the white made, how to listen to the wind in the chimney and distinguish natural sounds from something more. She showed herbs from her garden corner, explained their properties, pennyroyal for women's complaints, tansy for fever, foxglove for the heart, though it could kill if the dose was wrong. It was innocent knowledge, the kind every woman carried in the Caribbean, the kind that kept people alive in a world without doctors. But in Puritan New England, it was something else entirely. Herbal knowledge was acceptable from English goodwives who learned from their mothers. From a dark-skinned Caribbean woman, it became suspect, smacking of popery, heathen practices, the folk magic the church condemned as devil worship. Tituba must have known this. She had lived in Massachusetts over 2 years by then, long enough to understand how differently her knowledge was perceived. But she continued anyway, perhaps because the risk seemed small compared to the reward of those few hours when she was treated as something other than property. And Putnam Jr., 12 years old and daughter of the powerful Thomas Putnam, heard about the sessions from Abigail. The two girls had become friendly at church gatherings, and Abigail, proud of her secret knowledge, couldn't resist hinting. And demanded inclusion and brought several others, Elizabeth Hubbard, 17, who lived with the village doctor, Mary Walcott, 16, from another prominent family, Mercy Lewis, 19, a servant in the Putnam household who had survived an Indian raid that killed her parents. The circle grew to 8 or 9 girls, ages 9 to 19. They gathered in the Paris kitchen on late January afternoons, ostensibly for prayer and needlework, but really to hear Tituba describe a world so different from their frozen, restricted existence it might as well have been another planet. They practiced the egg and glass divination, trying to see future husbands in the shapes. They learned about herbs. They heard stories of people who could see the future, communicate with the dead, influence events through ritual. For the girls, this was thrilling. Their lives were severely constrained by Puritan expectations: no dancing, no singing except psalms, no games, no frivolity. Their futures were predetermined: marriage, childbearing, household labor, early death. The knowledge Tituba offered suggested other possibilities, other ways of having power in a world that offered them none. What none knew was that Tituba was being watched. Reverend Parris had noticed the change in his daughter, a new animation, whispered conversations with Abigail that stopped when he entered. He suspected youthful mischief, perhaps even dangerous frivolity that could corrupt a young soul. He began to spy on his own household, listening at doors, watching through floorboard cracks. What he heard alarmed him: Tituba speaking of practices he recognized as witchcraft, his daughter and niece participating eagerly, other village girls involved. This was exactly the corruption he had warned of, Satan working through innocent-seeming vessels. But Parris didn't act immediately. He was calculating, always aware of his precarious position. An accusation of witchcraft was serious, dangerous to the accuser if unproven. He needed certainty, evidence. So he watched and listened, gathering information, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in late January when Betty Parris began to have fits. They started as screaming nightmares waking the household. The 9-year-old would sit bolt upright, eyes wide but unseeing, shrieking of flames and demons. Mrs. Parris rushed to comfort her, but Betty seemed not to recognize her own mother. She spoke in a strange voice, sometimes crying meaningless words, sometimes going rigid and silent for minutes. The fits progressed quickly. Soon Betty had episodes during the day, crying out in pain, contorting her body. She would freeze mid-task, staring at something no one else saw. She complained of being pricked by invisible needles, of pressure on her chest making it hard to breathe. She tried to throw herself into the fire and had to be restrained. Reverend Parris initially thought this divine punishment for some household sin. He led hours-long prayer sessions, begging God to reveal the transgression. But the fits worsened. Betty began convulsing, her body jerking violently. She made sounds like a dog barking or cat hissing. She tried to bite those who came near. The village doctor, William Griggs, was called. Elderly, with limited medical knowledge trained through apprenticeship, he examined Betty thoroughly, checking for fever, signs of disease, asking about diet and habits. He found nothing physically wrong: pulse strong, color good, no illness signs. Yet clearly something was terribly wrong. After several visits, Dr. Griggs spoke the words that would doom Salem: "The evil hand is upon her." In the medical understanding of the time, this was a diagnosis of last resort. When no natural cause could be found for an illness, especially one with strange behaviors and convulsions, supernatural causes were considered. The evil hand meant witchcraft. Someone was using occult means to torment the child. The diagnosis spread through the village like wildfire. The minister's daughter was bewitched. Satan had struck at the heart of the godly community. If the minister's own household wasn't safe, no one was. Within days, Abigail Williams showed similar symptoms. She had fits, screaming, and convulsing. She claimed to see specters, ghostly figures tormenting her. She tried to run up the chimney, insisting she could fly. She spoke in voices not her own. The two girls' afflictions seemed to feed each other, each episode triggering the other. Then and Putnam Jr. began having fits, then Elizabeth Hubbard, then Mary Walcott. The affliction spread among the girls in Tituba's circle, each developing similar symptoms, freezing mid-conversation, crying out as if stabbed by invisible needles, seeing visions, dark shapes in corners, animals speaking with human voices, women flying through night air. The pattern was remarkably consistent across all. They experienced sudden fits of screaming and convulsing, periods of rigid paralysis, sensations of being pricked, pinched, or bitten by invisible forces, visions of specters others couldn't see, speaking in strange voices or languages, attempting dangerous acts like running into fire or up chimneys, physical contortions seeming impossible. Modern medical historians have proposed explanations: ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, a fungus causing convulsions and hallucinations, encephalitis, epilepsy, psychological factors like mass hysteria or conversion disorder. Some argue the girls faked, engaged in conspiracy. But in February 1692, only one explanation made sense to the villagers: witchcraft. Someone was using demonic power to torment these innocent girls. The question was, who? The village erupted into panic. Families gathered for hours-long prayer meetings, begging God for protection. Reverend Parris preached of Satan's assault on the godly, of the need to root out witches who covenanted with the devil. The Putnams, powerful and influential, demanded action. If Satan had a foothold in Salem village, the godly had to destroy it. But there was a problem: the afflicted girls wouldn't name their tormentors. When asked who afflicted them, they cried out in pain, claiming witches choked them to prevent speech. This went on for weeks, building tension and fear. Behind the scenes, pressure built on the girls to name names. Their families questioned them repeatedly. Reverend Parris interrogated Betty and Abigail for hours. Village leaders made it clear the crisis couldn't end until witches were identified. The girls were the only ones who could see specters, the only ones who could name the guilty. The whole community depended on them. It's impossible to know what went through the girls' minds. Were they genuinely experiencing what they interpreted as supernatural attack? Caught in shared delusion, each girl's symptoms reinforcing others. Consciously fabricating, enjoying the attention and power. Or some combination, starting with genuine illness or distress, then shaped by adult expectations and pressure. What's clear is that by late February, the girls were ready to name names, and the names weren't random. On February 25, 1692, arrest warrants were issued for 3 women: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Each was carefully selected for maximum vulnerability. Sarah Good was perhaps 40, though she looked older. Once from a respectable family, her father's suicide and legal battles over his estate left her impoverished. Her first husband died leaving debts. Her second, William Good, was a laborer barely supporting them. They were homeless, moving place to place, sleeping in barns, begging. Sarah had a sharp tongue, cursed those who refused charity. She smoked a pipe, unusual for a woman. She'd recently given birth to a sickly baby girl. Sarah was exactly the kind Puritans associated with witchcraft: poor, angry, disreputable, on society's margins. Sarah Osborne was late 50s, bedridden with illness. She had scandalized the community years earlier by living with her second husband before marriage. She'd also been in a legal dispute with the Putnams over land. She rarely attended church, claiming illness prevented it. Like Sarah Good, she was already marked as different and difficult, someone the community would easily believe capable of witchcraft. And then Tituba, enslaved, dark-skinned, foreign, known to have Arab and Caribbean knowledge. The perfect scapegoat, legally powerless, no family to defend her, no standing to refuse demands. But Tituba was also the key. The Putnams had been asking questions, gathering information. They knew of the kitchen sessions, the stories, the divinations. They knew she taught practices interpretable as witchcraft. They knew she was vulnerable. And they knew if she confessed, it would validate everything: the girl's afflictions, the witchcraft conspiracy, the need for aggressive prosecution. What they didn't know was Tituba had already made a choice. She had seen this coming, watched the afflictions spread, heard the whispers, felt the net closing. She knew she'd be accused, and decided exactly how to respond. The preliminary examinations were March 1st in the Salem Village Meeting House. The building was packed, nearly every villager there to witness. People stood in aisles, crowded the gallery, pressed against walls. The atmosphere was electric with fear and anticipation. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin had traveled from Salem town to conduct proceedings. Hathorne was a wealthy merchant and politician, powerful in the colony, deeply convinced of witchcraft's reality and the need for aggressive prosecution. He conducted examinations not as neutral inquiries but as prosecutions, assuming guilt and demanding confession. The afflicted girls sat prominently, surrounded by family who supported them during fits: Betty and Abigail Parris, and Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis. Ages 9 to 19, in that moment they held more power than anyone. Their words would determine who lived and died. Sarah Good was questioned first. Brought in haggard and defiant, baby in arms, Hathorne began with an accusation disguised as a question. "Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" "None." "Have you made no contract with the devil?" "No." "Why do you hurt these children?" "I do not hurt them. I scorn it." The magistrate pressed, asking the same questions differently, trying to trap her. Sarah denied everything with sullen defiance, insisting innocence, never hurt the children, never covenanted with the devil. But her denials were interrupted as the afflicted girls writhed and screamed, claiming Sarah's specter tormented them even as she stood there. "Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done?" Hathorne demanded. "Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children?" "I do not torment them." "Who do you employ then to do it?" "I employ nobody." "What creature do you employ then?" "No creature, but I am falsely accused." The examination lasted hours. The girls continued fits, crying that Sarah's specter choked them, stabbed them with invisible needles. Sarah's own husband, William, testified. He said he was afraid his wife was a witch or would be one soon, claimed she was an enemy to all good. This testimony from her own husband was devastating. In Puritan culture, a husband should defend his wife. William Good's willingness to testify suggested even her closest relation believed her guilty. The magistrates took it as powerful evidence. After hours of interrogation going nowhere, Sarah denying, the girls accusing, she was led away to be held for trial. Sarah Osborne came next, brought in on a chair, too ill to stand long. She too denied all charges, growing desperate as magistrates ignored her protests. She was sick, had been ill for months. How could she torment children when she could barely leave bed? "The devil may appear in your shape and do mischief without your knowledge or consent," Hathorne suggested, introducing spectral evidence central to the trials. The idea was a witch's specter, her ghostly form, could leave her body and torment people while she was elsewhere. This made defense impossible. An alibi meant nothing if your specter could act independently. The afflicted girls convulsed. Abigail Williams shrieked that Sarah Osborne's specter pressed on her chest, suffocating her. And Putnam cried she saw Sarah's specter with a yellow bird sucking between her fingers, supposedly a familiar spirit, a demon in animal form serving the witch. Sarah Osborne protested innocence but made a fatal mistake. She mentioned once being frightened by a thing like an Indian, all black, that appeared in a dream. The magistrate seized on this. She had seen a demon, admitted to supernatural experience. This was taken as evidence of guilt. The old woman was dragged away weeping, still protesting innocence, never hurt anyone. Then they brought in Tituba. She stood before the magistrates, a dark-skinned woman in plain gray dress, eyes downcast. Reverend Parris sat in front, face rigid. He had beaten her the night before. She would later testify, demanding to know what she'd done to his daughter. The welts on her back throbbed with each breath. She knew what they wanted. More importantly, she knew what they needed. The meeting house fell silent. Everyone leaned forward. This was the moment, the examination of the foreign woman who brought heathen practices into their godly community. Magistrate Hathorne asked the first question, "Tituba, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" She raised her eyes, met his gaze directly. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched. Then, in a clear voice carrying to every corner, she spoke, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." The meeting house erupted, gasps, cries, people calling to God. This was the first confession. After hours of denials, here was confirmation witchcraft truly walked among them, proof the girl's afflictions were real, the devil operating in Salem Village. Hathorne leaned forward, eager, "Who have you seen with the devil?" And Tituba began to speak. She described a tall man from Boston dressed all in black who came to her, demanded she sign his book in blood. He appeared sometimes as a man, sometimes dog, sometimes hog. He showed her a book with 9 names, though she couldn't read most. She saw Sarah Good's name there, and Sarah Osborne's. Others too, but she didn't know who. What did the devil promise if you would serve him? He said he would give me many fine things. What did he want you to do? Ah, he wanted me to hurt the children. And did you hurt them? Here Tituba paused, tears streamed down her face. He made me hurt them. I tried not to, but he was too powerful. He hurt me when I refused. She showed marks on her arms, bruises that could be from anything, but she claimed devil's punishments. The magistrates questioned her for hours that first day. The crowd listened, rapt. Tituba's testimony was everything they hoped and more. She described vivid encounters with the devil. He came at night, first as a tall man with white hair dressed in black like a minister. He told her she must serve him or he'd kill her. He showed his book, demanded she sign. When she refused, he hurt her, pinching, threatening worse. Eventually, she said, she gave in. She signed the book not with pen but blood from her finger. The devil pricked her finger, she made her mark. After, he had power over her. He commanded her to hurt the children, she had to obey. How did you hurt them? He gave me things to use, poppets, little dolls made of rags. He told me to stick pins in them, and when I did, the children felt pain. Where are these puppets now? I don't know. He took them away. Who else have you seen with the devil? I saw Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. They were at a meeting with the devil. Others too, a tall man with white hair, a woman with white hair. I don't know their names. This was crucial. Tituba described not just individual witches but a conspiracy, a coven meeting with the devil. This confirmed the magistrate's worst fears, not isolated cases but organized assault on the godly community. Where did these meetings take place? At the minister's house. The crowd gasped. They came at night, flying through the air. The devil brought them. How did they fly? On sticks, like poles. They rode through the air. Did you fly with them? Yes. The devil made me. We flew to Boston and back in one night. This detail, flight to Boston, was particularly significant. It suggested the conspiracy extended beyond Salem Village to the provincial capital. The threat was larger than imagined. The examination continued into a second day, then a third. Each session drew larger crowds, people traveled from surrounding towns to hear Tituba. She became the star witness, revealing the conspiracy's full extent. With each telling, her testimony expanded, more details, more encounters, implicating more people without naming them directly. She spoke of a yellow bird the devil gave as a familiar spirit. It sucked blood between her fingers, a black dog appearing, demanding she serve the devil, a red cat and black cat also familiars, midnight rides through air to witch meetings, a white-haired woman and tall white-haired man also witches, though she didn't know names, the devil's book with 9 names, suggesting 9 witches total operating. She wept frequently, insisting she wanted to return to God, had been forced into devil's service against her will. She begged forgiveness, said she'd tell everything to help catch other witches. It was brilliant. Every detail vivid enough to seem true, vague enough to be unverifiable. She gave magistrates exactly what they wanted, Not just confession, but proof of vast conspiracy. The hysteria consuming Salem over coming months had its foundation in those 3 days of testimony. But there was something else in Tituba's words, something magistrates didn't consciously register but astute listeners detected. She was describing real people. When she spoke of the tallman from Boston, certain families exchanged glances. When she mentioned the white-haired woman, whispers rippled through sections of the crowd. Tituba was settling accounts. Consider what she was doing, an enslaved woman with no legal rights, no property, no power, beaten, threatened, accused of a crime carrying death. She could have denied like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. But she saw what happened to them, denials ignored, assumed guilty anyway, likely executed. So instead, Tituba confessed, strategically. She gave magistrates a story confirming their beliefs while implicating people who harmed her or whom she resented. The tallman from Boston in black like a minister, that could fit wealthy merchants who visited Paris. The white-haired woman resembled Sarah Osborne but also other women who treated Tituba poorly. She painted accusations in broad strokes, letting others fill in specific faces based on their own grievances. And it worked beyond her darkest imaginings. Over coming months, as more were accused, many matched Tituba's descriptions. She'd given Salem a template for identifying witches, and villagers used it enthusiastically. On the third day, Magistrate Hathorne made a crucial decision. Tituba's confession was so valuable, so detailed, she wouldn't be tried immediately like the others. Instead, she'd be held as witness against other suspects. They needed her testimony to build cases against the conspiracy she revealed. Tituba was led away to jail. She'd saved her own life through words, at least temporarily. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne would die, Sarah Osborne in prison of illness in May, Sarah Good hanged on Gallows Hill in July. But Tituba would survive because she gave Salem what it needed, not just a witch, but a doorway into a hidden world of evil. The problem, the doorway, once opened, couldn't be closed. March 1692 bled into April, accusations multiplied like plague. The afflicted girls, emboldened by magistrates' belief and empowered by attention, began naming names. The names revealed the true nature of what was happening. On March 11, Martha Corey was accused, shocking. Martha was a full church member, known for piety and sharp intelligence. She'd expressed skepticism about the girls' afflictions, suggesting they might fake. She questioned spectral evidence. If the devil could appear in someone's shape without consent, how prove guilt? Her skepticism made her suspect. The logic was circular, inescapable. Only a witch would question witchcraft reality. Only someone in league with the devil would doubt the girls' testimonies. Martha's intelligence and independence, admired in a man, made her dangerous as a woman. When examined March 21, the afflicted girls performed dramatically. They mimicked her every movement. When she shifted weight, they shifted, bit her lip, they cried being bitten, wrung hands, they screamed hands being wrung. A grotesque pantomime, magistrates took it as proof. Clearly she controlled them through witchcraft, making them mirror her. Martha defended with logic and reason, pointed out absurdity, lack of evidence. But logic had no place. She was jailed for trial. March 23, Rebecca Nurse accused, even more shocking. Rebecca was 71, a grandmother so devout even those who disagreed with her family respected her. Hard of hearing, physically frail. The idea this elderly pious woman was a witch seemed absurd. But Rebecca's family, the Nurses, were in a long-standing land dispute with the Putnams. Years earlier, Nurses purchased land Putnams believed should be theirs. The dispute went through courts, decided for Nurses, but Putnams never forgave. Now, with Witch Hunt providing cover, old grievances settled. And Putnam Jr. was primary accuser, claiming Rebecca's specter tormented her. And Putnam Sr., the girl's mother, also began afflictions, accused Rebecca of murdering several infant children through witchcraft, a cruel accusation. And Sr. had indeed lost multiple babies, common tragedy colonial times. Now she attributed natural deaths to supernatural malevolence. Rebecca's examination was heartbreaking. The old woman could barely hear questions, stood confused and frightened while girls writhed and screamed, accusing torment. She protested weakly, "I can say before my eternal Father I am innocent," and God will clear my innocency. But God didn't clear her, at least not to magistrates. She was jailed. Her arrest sent a clear message: no one safe. If Rebecca Nurse accused, anyone could be. The pattern clear: anyone questioning proceedings, doubting girls' visions, became suspect. Opposition interpreted as evidence of guilt. The witch hunt developed internal logic, making it self-perpetuating, impossible to stop. By March end, over a dozen accused and arrested. By April end, over 30. Jails in Salem, Ipswich, Boston overflowed. Conditions horrific: prisoners kept in chains, not just handcuffs but heavy iron shackles on wrists and ankles, sometimes chained to walls. Weight caused injuries, cutting flesh, making movement painful. Cells dark, cold, filthy. Prisoners got minimal food, had to pay for imprisonment, fee for each day, 4 chains, even arrest warrant. Those who couldn't pay suffered worse. Sarah Good gave birth in jail, manacled. Infant died within days. Her 4-year-old daughter Dorcas also arrested after girls claimed child specter bit them. Little Dorcas kept in chains so heavy she could barely move. She'd survive physically but carry psychological scars lifelong, never fully recovering. Accusations followed patterns revealing true nature. Accused tended those in property disputes with accusers' families, those questioning proceedings or expressing skepticism, those already marginalized, poor, elderly, socially awkward, those whose families opposed Paris or supported his enemies, women too independent, outspoken, wealthy, or poor, anyone making enemies in Salem's small, claustrophobic world. Behind public spectacle, a more calculated campaign unfolded. The Putnam family at center. Thomas Putnam, most influential man in Salem Village despite never holding high office. Family among first settlers, owned significant land, though not as much as he believed deserved. His fathers were disappointed, leaving property to a stepmother Thomas despised. Several land disputes with neighbors went against him. He supported Paris fiercely, seeing minister as ally against Salem town elite looking.